Hello, fellow procrastinators. Welcome to the podcast. Through making this thing, I realized that not only my friends listen to it, so I realized maybe I should have a short intro to introduce the guest, tell people who they are. I want to keep it short, but it needs to be here. So I'll get out of the way very quickly, but I want to tell you today about Dirk Brockmann, the guest. He is a physicist. He's a complex systems researcher. He's a professor of biology at the Humboldt University of Berlin. He's also at the Robert Koch Institute of Berlin, also a professor there. And before returning to Berlin to take up these prestigious posts, he was a professor at Northwestern University. He is a man of many talents. His work spans pioneering papers on mobility, papers on the spread of infectious disease, and lots of super cool papers on the merging of those two. For example, there's a super nice paper where he develops this idea of effective distance that was in Science a couple years ago. But as I said, it's also broad interest. I looked on the webpage and I saw a paper on the social network of bees. So many things going on. Finally, I should also say Dirk has been a crucial voice of reason on COVID-19 since the pandemic broke out worldwide, but also very much so in his native Berlin, Germany. Let's call it Germany, his native Germany. They love him there. He's a kind of celebrity. We don't get into it because I think he might be fed up with it, but also, and he's done incredible and important academic work on COVID as well. Now, Dick's also a rebel. You cannot fence him in, control him. So he immediately rebelled against the rules even of this podcast. And when he said, here's my paper for the podcast, he sent someone else's paper. Experience tells me if life says, let's take a detour, I say, let's take it. Let's go on the detour. Those are usually the best ones. So in the podcast, we talk about a review paper by Ilana Silva Rosenberg and Eugene Rosenberg about the hologenome theory of evolution. And let me tell you, it was glorious. It was crazy. I learned so much. I understand really that he's not just a physicist as I know him, but he's really a biologist. And he goes on, he's relentless, he's methodical, and he takes me into this, in the podcast, amazing world of creatures and critters, little micros, something. I was going to say microbiome, but anyway, small creatures, we get it. And also I detect an undercurrent of a message about how, dare I say, political in this story about evolution as a massive collaboration, not as telling a story of evolution as this big network of mutually supporting behavior. It's incredible. There are hand-drawn illustrations. You don't need to look at them to understand the awesome stories, but it makes sense. So anyway, if you love science and discovery, this is for you. Let's go. I'll get out of the way. Enjoy. Perfect. All right, we're doing it.
One more. I need to switch these on awareness. They can be switched on awareness.
What is this? What does that mean?
So yeah, it's the opposite of noise canceling. It's when you want to when you want
the noise to pass through.
Yeah, you want to hear if the cat wants to get in the room, or if someone calls me.
Yeah. It's basically like if you're too lazy to take your noise canceling headphones out of your ear, you just
exactly.
Like if you want to be that person, who's wearing headphones and talking to someone, that's the
right.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, and when you ride a bicycle or drive in a car, that sort of thing, I guess.
It's a good idea, yes, not to be killed in traffic.
And I only discovered it by accident. You can press this button and it says noise canceling, and then it says off, and then it says awareness.
Nice. I mean, awareness
It's all in this
is
little
also some
instrument.
kind of like deep spiritual reminder, to be in the moment.
Yeah.
This awareness.
Or
So
be aware of your environment.
yes,
You could also just take out your earbuds and not listen to music or a podcast or an audiobook. You can just walk and listen to your environment.
yes, I heard about this. They used to
Yeah.
do this in the old days, apparently.
Yes.
Dirk,
That's
it's so
funny.
good to see you. I'm gonna
Yes.
slowly get this started somehow. I already
Sure.
started recording. This is what they do on all the famous podcasts. They just kind of start rolling, and you can just ease into
Right.
it.
I see the recording, and I also made some drawings for this podcast.
I love it. I look forward to them already. I want to have full disclosure here and kind of say that you and I are not only scientists together, but we're also kind of friends, I would say. I mean, actually, I would say we're
I would
friends,
say that too.
but I would be, I
I
was
always refer to you as my friend in Copenhagen.
good. I'm glad because I think of you as my friend, but as I was saying it, I was a little bit worried you'd be like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Like it's my
Well, if we
acquaintance.
lived in the same city, we would probably be very good friends
Yes.
and see each other more frequently, I guess.
It's for sure I would love so. But because of that, I know things about you, Dirk, that people don't know, and I think we need to get out there, right? So clearly, it's well known that you're an amazing scientist. We know this already. Some people also know that you make the best keynote presentations, the best, in the software. That whenever you see a Dirk Brockmann presentation, it's unbelievable. It's like the Pixar movies of presentations with ingenious little animations and so on. I know that you build model airplanes that can fly, that really can fly, little
That's true.
airplanes
And helicopters. Yes.
and
Yes.
helicopters. Now, yes, you've gone the drone way.
Now everyone knows about this. Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Yes.
I
I just
I
like flying. I like the idea that you can build with your hands an instrument that can fly.
yes,
To me,
it's
it's
insane.
just insane.
Yes, and I mean, and I
The
think
Mars helicopter, which is totally crazy.
yes, no. I think I agree, and I think it connects to something that I associate with you, which is a kind of getting to know you is a kind of you love thoroughness and quality, right? Like this is if I had to come up with something,
Yes.
you like to do things well, and so some of the things you also do is, in addition to writing papers, you build these incredible complexity explorables where you figured out how to use a modern data visualization and you build these perfect little universes to explore ideas from science. So you do all these, you're kind of a renaissance man,
That's nice.
a little bit. So I needed to get that out there to just put this context. I hope it's okay. But I guess just to get interested, we need to know a little bit about you. So tell me a little bit about sort of the framing. I guess is science is there's so many different reasons people do science. So my guess was this
Right.
thoroughness and quality that you like, and science is a way of expressing that. But I guess why are you doing this? Why are you a scientist?
Well, that goes way back. And I'll tell you a little bit about sort of the origin of things, which is, I'm a physicist by training. And when I started becoming interested in how the world works and what pieces hold the world together, it really started in physics because it was like the feeling that it conveyed to me when I read about relativity or cosmology or quantum mechanics. It's an almost religious experience when you ask yourself, how could it be this way? It's it's very hard to convey but it's really an emotion. So it's not only trying to figure out how things work, but once you have, it triggers an emotion, which to me is just the closest to a sort of a spiritual experience that I can get. And I used to have that more. Sometimes I still have it now. It's more like related to biology nowadays, but back then it was really physics
Yeah.
and forces, and how things can be this way, and you ask yourself why, what's going on, and it's so weird. And sometimes I'm so happy that I was exposed to this and that I learned all this stuff, because in my mind, knowing that there are like four forces and that hold things together, and how gravity works and space-time, that sort of stuff is still with me a lot.
Yes.
But very early on, I guess it wasn't limited to that sort of thing. And it's also not like the math that often, like in physics, in theoretical physics, which is where I'm from, mathematics and physics, they go hand in hand. And there are things in math that I really like a lot, especially weird little, relationships that are surprising, or, the distribution of prime numbers, that sort of thing. But I see this more as a physicist, like a thing that is there, and I look at it and I'm puzzled by it. But I've never seen this, I've always been more like a physicist in terms of I'm interested in the things that I see, and I would like to see them as they are.
Yep.
And often in science, that's not the case. People have like massive biases and sort of distorted caricatures in their head, even like the best scientists. And very early on, other things became interesting to me, especially in biology or social science, more so in biology, I would say. And, patterns that are interesting, like biology is full of patterns and weird structures, like a tree. Why does a tree look like a tree? And and all these weird things of which they just came out of nothing. For like a number of billion years, they just emerged.
But
and
but do you think
that's so odd?
Yes, it is odd.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I mean, part of why it's fun to talk is I think a lot about these things as well, and these patterns. And do you think that there is a kind of analogy somehow between the patterns that that are the laws of nature and the patterns that we see in biology? Somehow that, like, the way that I think about it now is kind of that if you establish a set of rules, then like it very easily beautiful patterns follow. So it's a kind of game of life thinking, right? That you make a rule to say you have your square and you make it black, and if it's the square neighborhood is this, you do this, and if the neighborhood is something else, you do something else.
Right.
From that simple rule, we like you get dinosaurs and fish in those little patterns.
Exactly.
Right?
But yeah, and it's beautiful. It's like the emergence of things that are hidden in these rules or mathematical models, and then this happens, and you're like, whoa, how can that be? Or like collective behavior is another, like swarming is another example. Yes. But these patterns, I kind of drifted towards biology because they're like everywhere. It's like you walk through the forest and everywhere are all of these interactions and all of these patterns, and they're stable, and life has existed for such a massive amount of time, and it's so robust, and or like embryogenesis, like how we we are a cell when we begin.
Yeah.
You were like an egg in your mother, but your mother developed what would become Sune when she was an embryo in your grandmother. It's like crazy. And then
Yes.
like the cell divisions occur, and there's this massively complex organism that emerges, even like a fly or a worm there. It's just amazing. And you look at this and you ask, how can this be
Yes.
just by a set of rules? And it's crazy.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. For like complicated reasons, I also have a past with morphogenesis, and it is insane, right? That
Yeah,
like
it is
the
totally
hand
insane.
forms, and it's a little thing, and then all of a sudden the cells between the fingers, they go like, all right, now it's time to turn off, so we can
To
have
go. Yeah, I know.
no, and it's like, how do they know where they are? How do they know that
Yeah,
they're the cells
yeah,
that are between the? It's unbelievable,
it's
and it's
pretty
still
crazy.
something we
Yeah.
don't understand. Um, yeah, amazing. So in doing science in a way, you found this early on, and you thought, I have to go in this direction. Is that the thing, or?
Yeah. Well, like it's also like a number of random events, essentially. Like when I got my master's, I was already working on something that was more related to life. And when I started my PhD, I was initially working on neural networks, which is another
Yes.
thing that I found amazing. That like this was like, I started reading about this in the 90s, in the early 90s, and there were like little computer programs that you could play with, and I thought it was crazy that you can store like letters in a bunch of neurons that work in, that are just a set of equations in a computer. And now all of this has evolved to like, software that can detect whether there's a cat in the picture, which is but basically the same principle. And then I went through this sort of brain, I would like to understand the brain phase, but then that bored me again. It didn't bore me, but I thought it was very sort of, in the community that I was in, everyone was speaking about the brain, the most complex system in the universe. And I was very annoyed by these kind of statements because they're very anthropocentric. And how could you say that? You're just this sort of little mammal on Earth, and you say your brain is the most complex thing in the universe, let alone that you cannot even understand, say, a forest. Just because you don't understand it, you can just not claim your little organ in your head is the most complex. And that annoyed me. And there was a lot of that in neuroscience back then.
Yeah.
And also, it's just, a brain. Why it's interesting, but it's as interesting to understand a worm to me now, or a tree,
But it's
or a
also,
forest.
but
And
is it also like a thing with me and the brain? I think is also that it seems to me that the gap is kind of too big. Like the worm is nice because it feels like we're getting close to being able to really understand it. Like they mapped out, if you think morphogenesis for some of
yeah,
the worms,
yeah,
like they mapped out like every cell division, like it only has 1,000 cells or whatever, so they know
right,
like this
right.
cell is going to
C.
turn into like
elegans,
these.
yes.
Yes.
I know, they know exactly, and they always have the same number of cells, etc.
Yeah, so I mean,
Crazy.
in that sense, it seems the brain to me is, like it would be great to understand it, and I agree of the arrogance of saying it's the most complicated thing ever built, but at the same time, it is pretty complicated, and somehow to me, there's this idea that yeah, the gap is too big. I don't feel that I can contribute anything yet with the kind of things
I get it. Right.
that the kind of insights that I would like to provide, where different systems, it feels that you can, like there's more data, there's more understanding of the wiring and how everything works together, so you can actually begin to really not just have associations but something more, right? Ideas of mechanisms and so on.
I get it. I just felt like I needed to get away from this because I felt it was like I'm trying to understand an organ that I have in my head, and there's so much more
Yes.
out there. It's like this. And I've always been kind of adverse to and also in social science and any kind of science that puts like an emphasis on our special dispensation of, being a smart primate. And there's so much, and like, if you look at it like in the grand scheme of things, there have been lots of hominids like us, and they came and they disappeared again, and that's probably also going to happen to us. And we've been like the most successful hominid, Homo erectus, was around, I think, for a time, pretty much like T-Rex. It appeared and it disappeared again, and that's probably also going to happen to us. And I see no reason to believe that this isn't so. We're just not very successful as a species in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I mean, at least I hear, this is not an area of my expertise at all, but I hear people saying that probably this century is a pretty critical time in either figuring out very long-term better solutions or
Right.
kind of
for us, not for
yes.
the planet.
No.
The planet doesn't really care much about us. There's so many interesting, I mean, I really think it's very naive and it's also very egocentric to think that we can do anything to this planet. We can't. It's like life's been around for like 3 billion years or approximately, and it's been covered by ice for long periods of time, entirely almost. There have been like mass extinctions, many of them, and we cannot get rid of life or alter it in any way that is comparable to what other organisms have, like the organisms that started making oxygen. They shaped the earth more than any of us. Or I just recently learned there's a small organism in the ocean that they discovered like in the 80s. It's a very small photosynthetic bacterium, and it's the most abundant species on Earth. And they discovered it in the 80s, I think, or even in the 90s, I can't remember. And it's responsible for like a substantial fraction of the oxygen that is produced. And it's this tiny little, it's called, what is it called? Prochlorococcus, I think. It's massively abundant. It's the most successful and most abundant organism, and it generates all this oxygen. And we were so dumb, we had to wait until like the 80s to discover it. So there's so many examples like this.
Yes, and I think it'll be so interesting to see. Also, so I think we should keep this podcast COVID free. Since,
yes. Oh yeah, that's why I'm doing it.
Exactly. But I think climate change is another one of those reasons why there might be trouble on the horizon in a way that
right, for us as a species.
But whatever's going on, it's pretty clear that as a species we've been successful enough to impact the climate in a
sure.
substantial way. And I think it's interesting to think about this thing with the technological solutions to climate change. Some of the optimists say like we're going to fix it with technology, and this thing that you bring up with this this unknown bacterium reminds me, it's kind of like breastfeeding for babies. That we kind of think, we looked into what's in the milk, and we can do something that's better. Let's put together a formula, and it's going to be great. And I mean, and then we begin to study breastfeeding, and we figure out that it's this insane dance of signaling hormones and transfer
and microbes. Yeah,
exactly.
It's
and so that these processes, exactly because they've been evolved over a long time scale, too big for us to really kind of fathom and imagine, they can really develop this incredible complexity.
And what you just said is also like a signal of what is pervasive in science and humanity, is the arrogance with which we think we can outperform nature in her design, and that's nonsense.
Exactly. And so, I mean, I had some more stuff I wanted to talk about before we got into the paper, but I feel like we're so close now
We're
to the paper
close,
you
yes.
wanted to
We're
talk
getting
about
there. Yes.
that we need to go straight into that. And maybe then we'll wrap up with some more
Right.
silliness of my design. So as you know, you're clearly a rebel, and so as a guest, you said I want to talk about this paper, and you sent a paper that was not by you, which I
Right.
thought was a very cool, very cool move. But and it's about an idea that you've been thinking about for a long time, because I remember you sharing a book about this with me years ago.
Correct.
So,
right.
I was too lazy to read the book, and I've been too lazy to read the paper.
You should. It will change your mind.
But maybe we can start now, and you can tell me about it, and then we can circle back to some silliness, or maybe we just record the podcast and we see what we're doing. But yeah, tell me about this paper. What's the title of it? Who are the authors? And then we can kind of get into the meat of discussing it.
So here's the paper. That's the first page of the paper, and the title, I'm going to read it to you because I didn't memorize it. It's a long title. It's The Role of Microorganisms in the Evolution of Animals and Plants, the Hologenome Theory of Evolution. And it's by Ilana Silber-Rosenberg and Eugene Rosenberg. And it's a review article, a short one. And it represents really, and it's from 2008. So it's not really, a classic, but it's also not very recent. And it's representative of a set of, research ideas that, in my view, are going to change the way we look at evolution and biology and how things are connected in the living world. And I picked this paper because it just compiles a few ideas about this. So in essence, what the authors say, among others that started looking into this around that time, is that it makes no longer sense to look at evolution and life in terms of isolated species that eat each other, but rather as, holobionts. So what's a holobiont? That's an animal or a plant together with all its microbes that live in it or on it. And it turns out that, we've heard stuff about the gut microbiome. We have like our guts, and they're like microorganisms living in it, and they metabolize stuff, and they're essential for our health. When people have a messed up microbiome, they may develop allergies, etc., or get sick. We know all this, but the fact is that there's not a single plant species, there's not a single animal species, neither has there ever been an animal species or plant species or fungus that has not worked in a very tight and dense collaboration with bacteria, in life. And that's, maybe just a fact first, but it's also a paradigm shift in the way we think. And there are really two things that are involved here. That's evolution and, say Darwinian evolution, variation and natural selection and heredity. But there's also a perspective on microbes. And that's quite interesting. So these people say, because there's not a single, let's think about it like a host species, a human or a mouse or an insect, and they are covered with bacteria and they live in their guts and, sometimes even in their cells. And that's one unit in evolution. So when the processes the process of evolution is, people, not animals or plants or species, they replicate, and then they give these, not only, do they produce offspring, but they transmit also the microbes to their offspring. And there are various techniques they have, nature has developed to accomplish that. And variation and selection is also happening not on, say, the human species or a mouse by itself or a tree, but on this entire system of living entities that are bound together. And that has a lot of implications because all of these relationships are symbiotic. So they're positive. The microbes that live in your gut, they help you metabolize stuff, and you help them live in the protected environment of your gut. Yep. And there are countless examples of this, and they're not sort of fringe phenomena. They're the generic feature of nature. And what is happening here, in my view, and there's more and more evidence about this, is that collaboration and networking and symbiotic relationships are the generic feature of natural systems. And this is kind of in conflict with the general ideas that we associate with Darwinian evolution, like competition, outperforming others. And we've, when we watch a documentary on television about nature, there's like animals that eat other animals that eat other animals. There's males that compete for reproduction in front of the females. All of this is happening, but that's fringe. It's not generic. When you look at nature under a microscope, it's all about networking and collaboration.
But do you think it also has to do somehow with size scales, so that collaboration and competition is like at one scale? It's I mean, of course, societies happen at the same scale, but there's also something about the microbes and us, kind of, when I was a kid, I remember this amazing thought. Maybe it was like in a Superman magazine or something like this. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that, the atom kind of looks like a little planet. And so you imagine that there could be this kind of fractal nature of the universe where you could shrink down, and then there was like a little universe inside each atom that we that we live inside. And then you could scale out, and they would be unaware that we were there on the different level. And here it seems to me somehow there's like like a different vibe, that these microbes are inside us, they're part of us, and they're living in the gut, but that's their universe, right? That's their world or something.
Correct. That's it, and that's true for every plant and every animal species. But it doesn't even make sense to separate this anymore in terms of understanding evolutionary processes. So we need an evolutionary theory that goes beyond the concept of individual, that goes beyond the concept of species. And, if you go into the microscale, it's like in physics, there was classical physics. And then when people looked at a different scale, they thought, the rules are weird here.
Yeah.
Stuff doesn't behave anymore the way we are used to it. And I think when quantum mechanics developed, there was a lot of resistance in the physics community that, towards this new totally bonkers theory that tried to capture what was going on. And I think this is also now happening in biology, because we have all of these technologies that tell us about microbiological environments. There are biofilms where bacteria work together, and countless examples. And we have to remember that we, large animals or large plants, are really not a lot, in terms of species. There are like a few million species of animals and plants, but there are billions of species of bacteria. And so we are negligible. Humans are negligible. I mean, the earth has been ruled by bacteria for billions of years, and they came and they never left. And I think that's an important insight. And just to put it into context, because we are talking about evolution and bacteria or microbiological life, like when we rewind time 100 years, say, at the end of the 19th century, when Darwin developed his theory for evolution, and like his theory of evolution was integrated with, heredity, etc. There was like this new synthesis. Suddenly we knew what was going on. And when you see this, there are these concepts, survival of the fittest, that were misinterpreted, as fit just meaning, you fit into an environment.
Yeah.
And often, like in the Victorian era of Great Britain, that vibed very well with the political spectrum. So it was no surprise that like social Darwinism was derived from this, and all of this was explained by combat and competition and a fight for resources, etc. And at the same time, there was like the microbiologists that started looking at bacteria, and they discovered that some bacteria cause disease, which was a paradigm shift at that time. When Robert Koch, my institute that I work for is named after him. He discovered that some diseases are caused by life forms. That was crazy. To us, it's, we know it, but that back then it was like totally new. But immediately, everyone thought that bacteria are bad. When you say today, bacteria, everyone thinks it's bad. But the fraction of pathogenic bacteria in the set of all species of bacteria is negligible. It's almost like a freakish property to be pathogenic, to cause disease.
Yes.
But when Koch did this at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, he was very successful. There was suddenly hygiene, hospital hygiene, and a way to cultivate these bacteria in the lab and develop medication, penicillin, all of that came out of this. And so and in addition, like Darwin evolution imprinted on our interpretation of social systems as much as Koch's work imprinted on our image of microbes. And that is like, even 100 years later, it's still lasting with us. Interestingly, at the same time, there was a Russian school of microbiologists that looked at it in a different way. They thought that multicellular organisms were collectives of individual cells that work together as a state.
Yeah.
And they knew that there are other life forms that were single-celled, and multicellular organisms, they thought, this is just single cells and they just work together. Because back then they didn't know anything about the genome, etc. They just saw a bunch of cells in a highly structured organism and they thought they work together. And others looked at, bacteria as collections of organisms that exchange chemistry, and they, metabolize stuff, and whatever one produces as food for another. So they really emphasized the collaborative aspect. And it climaxed in a hypothesis that was made more than 100 years ago, when a Russian scientist said eukaryotes, which is plants, fungus, and animals, their cells have all of these organelles in them, as opposed to bacteria that are quite uniform inside to some extent. And when you look at an animal cell, there are like these things that are called mitochondria, and they produce energy for plants and animals. And they looked at, this guy looked at them and said, they look like bacteria. Maybe at some point in the history of life, two bacteria, essentially not a bacterium, but something similar, swallowed a bacterium and then they stayed together.
Yeah.
With a process called endosymbiogenesis. And the same for plants. They have like chloroplasts and they look like cyanobacteria. And he hypothesized this. It was forgotten for a long time. And then only later, Lynn Margulis, an evolutionary biologist and microbiologist, she was kind of a rebel. She was a real rebel. I mean, she has like legendary arguments with Richard Dawkins about symbiosis in nature. She said, okay, this happened during the lifetime, during the history of Earth, this happened a couple of times, these symbiogenesis events. And everyone thought she was totally nuts.
Yeah.
And especially these traditional old men evolutionary biologists, Darwinian evolution and neo-Darwinisms, Darwinists. They were very much against her ideas, and then only like later, when genetic methods were available, it was shown that she was right. And there are countless examples of this. And I think our scientific bias of evolutionary biology of the late 19th century and microbiology of the early 20th century really totally twisted our view of how nature works. And this paper that is the topic of today is part of sort of a new, like a paradigm shift in the way we see natural systems.
Yeah, I think this is awesome, and you're not going to get any pushback from me because I'm not kind of, it makes perfect sense to me. I'm not really closely wedded to this existing framework, so to me it makes perfect sense, and it makes perfect sense in the light of everything we know. And so I guess there are kind of two things that stick out to me. So number one, which is a thing that I completely love, is that it's conceivable that a huge branch of science has been going in like a pretty wrong direction for a long time, right? There's something completely fascinating about, in this day and age when we think we know everything, that it could be that actually, we've kind of, taken a slightly wrong turn and we have to course correct. If that's the case, I mean, of course, it is kind of like quantum theory. All the knowledge we built up is still there, but I like this idea that we can still be wrong. That's, to me, is completely fascinating.
Right.
Then there's another thread that, so maybe we can come back to that, but then there's another thread, which is this thing about, and coming back to our kind of warm up to talking about the paper, this thing about human beings meddling with nature in a way that's fundamentally unlike how nature develops stuff, right? So for example, we start saying, all right, we start having hospitals, we start opening people up, and this discovery by about bacteria and so on, in a way, is pretty important in a hospital, because even though we have the symbiotic relationship and so on, if you open up, like there's a wall that was never opened up evolutionarily, and we should be really careful because if we just kind of take all the outside microbes that are optimized for this and put it inside the belly and then close it up, it can be dangerous. And so, do you have any thoughts about this kind of these two different methods where we're making these primitive, or at least maybe not even primitive, but fundamentally different? It's the same thing to fixing the earth through climate change, through technology or whatever. That, like, there's a tension here, and of course, I guess we can learn something about how to be better at doing our human interventions in natural systems. But what are your thoughts on this kind of tension about these two different ways of interacting with bodies and nature?
Well, I think in terms of like how how this works. There are various events that happened. One is that, and that's quite generic in science, when people make a discovery like Koch about how bacteria can cause disease, especially successful men, in my experience, and especially when they get older, they put a lot of emphasis on their discovery, even if there's more evidence that speaks another language. Yes. Or like points into a different direction. I discover that more and more. So that's part of it. So there's a distorted perception of reality that puts your own discovery in the focus. And we didn't want to talk about COVID, but let me just give you one example because it's representative.
Yes.
Now, a pandemic is clearly a dynamic phenomena that occurs on very many scales. A lot of things play a role. Mm-hmm. There's a virus, so you have to understand how it interacts in the body. Virologists look at that. There's transmission dynamics, which is, there are aerosol researchers that look into this, and epidemiologists, and there are people that, like you, that study contact networks, and there's insights of that. And then there's social science plays a role because fear of the pandemic has an impact on how it unfolds. Psychological processes, behavioral processes. So it's happening on all of these economic processes, and on all of these levels, this is happening. And when you talk to people about this, and you put a lot of experts on the table or at a table, and they report, if a majority of them, they see their own aspect of the pandemic as blown up. And so they have a distorted perception of the entire system. That happens often when you put a lot of experts in a room that put a stronger emphasis on what they see than on what the others see. And this whole idea about complexity science is, I always say, it's like doing science like a fungus. It's more like you have like these different areas of expertise and things that play a role in this entire thing. And you may know that a fungus, when you walk through the forest, you see only the fruiting body, but the species itself is like under the surface, and it has like this network that connects like this tree with this tree. And so it's very distributed, very networky. And when you have a lot of sort of silverback old white men at a table, they only see what they see. And they don't listen, and they don't try to use another person's perspective and to get sort of a holistic picture of what's going on. And I think that's in this entire sort of evolutionary dynamics, biological systems, and microbiota, there are many examples of why this happened. And then it's translated into social aspects like social Darwinism. These ideas were so convincing at the end of the 19th century that people used it because it was resonating with their political ideas of, say, the British Empire, and colonization. And it's really funky because really famous people like Pearson, of the Pearson correlation. He did statistics, and he's really invented statistics in a sense. And he was a social Darwinist. He was a eugenicist, and was really proposing that people that were not as fit or as good should not have offspring to make the human race better. And the same is true for Fisher, a super famous population geneticist. He was applying these concepts to nations, and even like after the World War II, he was like writing positive things about how we could understand, that the Nazis were doing the best for their people. that sort of stuff. And
Yeah.
all of this has like a massive impact on the way we work as a society. And these really, really deep and twisted ideas, they're still in us. And so my hope is that when we look at the microbiological world and see that we're really collaborative entities, that we host like all of these microbes, and also on a larger scale that we see ourselves as nodes in a network of species that collaborate. It's more beneficial. It's just more, it's much more effective, and it's better for everyone.
Yes, but I mean, so first of all, I'm with you, and we carry so many biases with us in everything that we do, and I, and you and I do as well, right? Like that's like the
Right.
first step
Totally.
is to understand the
To
biases.
realize it, yes.
But I mean it. My question, like you gave definitely an answer to my question, but I meant it in a much more literal sense, in a way that I think
Okay.
it's fascinating to say that it's true that I'm convinced, I buy your thing that we are holobionts, and that we come as assemblages of us
Also
and
a
a lot
cool
of others.
word.
I know I'm going to be dropping it in casual conversation all the time.
Yes.
But I buy this. But as a human being acting in the world, I have no power to interact in this kind of sophisticated, or with this sophisticated, orchestrated collaboration that's happening. You know what I mean? Like if there's a ruptured appendix, I can't, we can't. The only way we can do is like we take a scalpel, we open up the belly,
Sure.
and we mess with it. And the same thing with climate
Right.
change is like, even though that the ideal solution would be much more kind of whole earth and doing something orchestrated, we're going to have to try the technology stuff, because
Sure.
what else what else we're going to do. So I'm more interested in this tension with us as actors who have no tools to interact with this complex biological reality that you're describing. Does that make sense? And so how do we
I understand. Well, we should like use technology not to in a way that or like in a context where we know that all these bacteria, say, live in and on us. If you have a ruptured appendix, sure, you need to be in a sterile room and make sure that not some of the few pathogenic bacteria get inside your guts, for instance.
Yep.
But at the same time, you have to keep in your mind that you may not use antibiotics as much as people used to, because then you generate antibiotic resistant bacteria, because they're just evolve much faster than we do. So you have to keep it in your mind. It's not like so this realization is not so much a back to nature, live in the woods kind of idea, but it's also it's not this black and white. We need to understand it. If you find out that kids, for instance, when they live in a farm, are less likely to develop a number of allergies because they are exposed to bacteria more than like the city dwellers of like freakish parents that sterilize their children's hands twice a minute. It's not good. And so it's always like there's sort of a middle way.
Yeah.
And it would be actually quite interesting to see a combination. And we see that already. For instance, like whenever I see like a picture of a skyscraper that is covered with plants, I think that's nice. It's a space for living, but it uses some of the technology of nature in order to create a good environment. And so we need to think more about both. aspects. And what we can learn in terms of society is that, you know, collaboration and networking in a positive way has been selected by natural selections as a successful strategy.
Yeah.
And so it's both really.
Yeah, no,
it's not, there's not a tension.
No.
It's just a, you know, both things add to the, I guess, human experience.
Yeah. And so another thing that I had in mind, you saw me scribbling before when you were starting on the paper, is so we know that genetically there is variability across individuals. What does this holobiome do for variability across individuals, do you think? Presumably it allows us to specialize to environments, but does it, you know, increase variability way more, or does it make us more the same because we compensate? Like, are there any thoughts about this?
Well, like variation is the currency of evolution, right?
Yes.
So it's the power, and variability is typically associated with our genome. And we have, like, let me just give you the example for humans. And we have around about 20,000 genes, a bit more, and it's not really, it depends a little bit on the definition, but say that's the order of magnitude. And like even way back, like 2008, people were estimating what the genome of your microbiome is, because all the bacterial species, they contribute genes.
Yep.
And it's, you know, usually 1 or 2 orders of magnitude larger. So in terms of like the stuff that the genes produce, if you look at your body, if you look at your bloodstream, there's like maybe 50% of the biochemicals that are in your bloodstreams come from bacteria. So in terms of like what you are chemically, you're at least, if not more, bacterium than you are a human being. And the variation in this comes mostly from the bacterial species. Maybe, you know, you are just, your genes are just there to build a brain and to have a body, but everything else is done by the bacteria. And in terms of cells, your body consists of like 100 billion human cells, and maybe like that number, and potentially more bacterial cells because they're smaller.
Yeah.
And so in terms of cell count, it's also pretty evened out. And that's, you know, for us the case. And the variation is in the genes. And what's interesting about the microbes is that you can not only, I mean, they evolve faster, so they're more responsive in terms of adaptation to new environments. For instance, you start, you know, you become vegan, for instance, then your gut microbiome changes. The distribution of different species changes, so it is adapted much quicker to your new diet. Or, you know, you live in a different environment because there's also, you know, lots of bacterial species on your surface, and then may change from A to B. So it makes you, just like a brain can adapt to different stimuli and trigger very quickly different responses, the same is true for your gut microbiome. And there's lots of variability on one hand, but there's also a lot of variability on how this collaboration works. I mean, the craziest, I need to give you this example because it's so crazy. I thought there are 2 crazy examples, and do you want to hear them? Yeah.
Yes.
Because I made 2 drawings for them. So
yes.
And I still want to show you my drawings.
Absolutely.
So one is a pretty crazy example, and it's about an insect called Aphid. It's like the little animals that live on plants, and they, you know, are parasitic to plants. I'm going to show you my drawing.
Yes, do it.
I've just made for this podcast.
Very good.
They look like this. Can you see
Nice.
this?
Yes, I see it. It's fantastic.
You
have to photograph it so we can put it in the show notes in case someone listens ear style.
we can do that. So they're very tiny, like a few millimeters, and they're like bright green often. And they have like 80 cells in their inside. They're called bacteriocytes.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look inside these cells, inside of these cells are like 6 million bacteria. They're endosymbionts. So these are bacteria that live in the cells of this little insect in a collaboration. And, inside these cells, these bacteria, do some biochemistry that is beneficial to the host. And at the same time, the host, the aphid, just contains them. And they're being passed on from generation to generation through the eggs of this insect.
Yep.
And this has been going on for 180 million years. So the Cambrian explosion was like 500 million years ago, I think.
Yeah.
So for like almost half that period of time, this connection between this insect and these small little bacteria has been going on. They just crawled in this insect and said, let's go, we can do this together. And what's so funny is that this bacterium inside the cells of this insect, they have one of the smallest genomes of all living creatures, because they don't need the genes anymore. So they just get rid of all the rubbish they didn't need. They just kept all the genes that they need for this cooperation. It's almost like a melting of two species together.
Yes. I love it.
It's been going on for 200 million years. And that's like a very tight collaboration. And there are many other insects that do the same thing with different species.
But it's almost like the continuum limit of this mitochondrial adaptation you were talking about before, right?
Correct.
This is how these types of processes maybe happen, right? That in the end they go like, you know what, let's just merge up or.
Right, and evolutionary, it plays a big role, because like one of the problems that Darwin had with his evolution was like this gradual variation, right?
Yes.
And but now imagine like a new collaboration happens just instantaneous, because like there's this merger, and suddenly this new insect has like the power of generating new chemicals for itself. Just by accident this happened. And so that's why, and this is like ongoing research now, how this hologenome or holobiont evolution is happening by like these establishing new relationships, and they're being selected.
Yes. But I absolutely love this idea. And in a way, it also connects to our kind of initial discussion on morphogenesis, how things take form. And but this is also almost, I keep thinking, also how we kind of maintain form, right? It's like the ship of Theseus, ship of Perseus. I can't remember, some Greek hero, right? Yeah. They had the ship lying down in Athens and it kept falling apart and they kept putting in new boards. And then the paradox is, well, when is it the same? When does it stop? Like you exchange all the wood, this ship is still standing. And we've been thinking about this, or the way that I heard this example given in a way is that the individual atoms in our cells are also replenished, right? So literally like 10 years from now, all that's left.
You're a different,
yeah, it's like it goes slowly in the brain and the bone marrow, but everything else is just in flux, right? But what you're saying is that this flux is even crazier, because it's also, like let's say that I move to I don't know, like North Africa or somewhere that's very different from here. Probably my hologenome is going to adapt to different foods, different temperatures, different so and so, and so and it's going to affect me, because some of these chemical products that are being produced are also going to be different. So it's how we are these, and it comes back to our discussion about patterns, right? We're these kind of fixed patterns that are robustly maintained through this enormous flux and adaptation.
Right. And then it's like there's a great variability, like the little insects that I just discussed. There, this relationship is millions, hundreds of millions of years old and very tight. And there's like this almost melting, like I said, of species. But that doesn't have to be that way. You know, it could also be very optional. They're like this you know, class of organisms called lichens, like you see them on rocks, like these little green sort of organisms. And, you know, sometimes you think this is, you know, just a very slowly growing plant or something, or a moss.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
But it's not, you know, it's a fungus.
Yes.
And it's a fungus that is in a symbiotic relationship with algae or cyanobacteria. So they're like these two species, and they're saying, let's work together. And it's a symbiotic relationship. But when they come together, they form these weird little organisms that, you know, these lichens that grow very slowly, you know, like normally like not more than 1 millimeter a year. They can get very old, like up to like 4,500 years. It's crazy. They're some of the oldest living individuals on the planet.
Yeah, nice.
And they cover like 5% of the surface of the Earth, so they're also very successful. But what I think is funny is that there can be different combinations, and some of these have algae or, you know, a fungus that can also exist without their cooperating agent. And when they do, they have a different form. So when they come together, they build a different morphology than when they live by themselves. So, you know, you have like these two, and they, you know, have their form and their shape and their phenotype. They come together, there's something new. And it's crazy and super successful. So it's really also sometimes optional. It's like when you go and live in a different place, you may be exposed to other bacteria that are there. You will, you know, get them somehow, and then your system will adapt. In fact, there were studies about the microbiome in different cultures and different groups, and even among families, they're closer, the microbiota in terms of the species they, you know, they contain, than among people that don't live together. So there's a lot of dynamics in it.
What about kind of, so I continue to be obsessed about the human meddling, right? Because I'm a human and I want to meddle. So is there a sense of, you know, so my body can produce stuff, like a lot of the nutrients that I need, I can produce in many different ways. So I'm pretty robust. But then there are also stuff that I need to eat, and then there's stuff that's generated by my microbiome. Are there any theories about kind of what's driving, you know, what compounds I can make versus that my little bacterial friends can make versus what comes in externally? Is that driven by evolution, or, you know, like if I'm starving, you know, God, are there any thoughts on this?
I'm not sure actually, like in terms of like the different biochemistry that is generated by bacteria versus us or the host. I'm sure there is differences because, you know, when there are experiments on mice that you grow in a lab without any bacteria, like they're sterile. And so studies have been carried out on mice like this, and they don't become very healthy. They survive, but their metabolism is entirely different. They develop all sorts of diseases. And you know, but even if you do that and then you infest them with a microbiota, they recover. So something is just missing. I don't know in terms of like the biochemistry what exactly it is, but it is essential, and people are meddling with this. I mean, there's even this it's a little weird, and I hope I'm just going to say it. So there are a lot of autoimmune diseases that are not curable, a lot of chronic diseases that are caused by an individual becoming allergic to itself.
Yes.
And some of these cannot be healed, and some of them are very dramatic. And so what people started doing is they started taking someone else's poop and put it in, the butt of the person with the disease. So they would infest the person with microbiome samples, or microbiota samples, hoping that these bacteria will generate the necessary chemistry to heal the immune system of the person. And that has been extremely successful in many cases.
Yep.
So where no medication works, nothing works. You just need poop from another person, and then the bacteria. That's actually also how, like, many mammals, like cows and other animals like that, that eat plants. Like a cow cannot digest plant. A cow needs lots of bacteria that live in the rumen, like in the stomach of the cow, in order to cut cellulose into little sugars and metabolize it. And when a little cow is born, it is exposed to the poop of the mother and ingests immediately some of the bacteria that are required for this. That's how it works. So that's, in that case, how it is transported from one generation to the next.
But this
also with humans, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. This I remember someone sharing that, now that we're on the poop story, that exactly like the way that babies are born, there's like a similar.
They need to be infected with poop. Yeah,
yes.
It's very, but just the story and the way we smirk at this indicates how biased we are towards like this hygiene concept that was put in place like 100 years ago.
Yeah, sure.
It's just, it's disgusting to us, but it's quite natural.
Yes, and it's but yeah, I mean, we could do a whole podcast. I looked into this a little bit about these like transplants, and like the rebel scientist, because like it's hard to get approval for this, so they were just kind of like, well, we're just gonna, let's just try it. There's some not crazy stories about this. So I have one more kind of personal question. So I was listening to another podcast with some of these longevity people about living a long time, and they love to talk about compounds that they eat to stay alive longer. So I was thinking maybe I should eat some compounds. And full disclosure, I'm not eating any compounds yet, but it makes me think. What do you think the role? Because it's on this meddling track again, right? We're these complicated beings. Huge collaborations, complex things going on, and they were like, yeah, I'm gonna eat some MNM as a precursor for NAD, because NAD is like a longevity drug or whatever. Like, what do you think about compounds? Is that as bad? Is that like similar to like what? Any thoughts? Just curious. Now that we're talking about this,
I can think about it spontaneously, and to me, it seems a reductionism in the wrong direction. It's also a simplification of things, and everything is very connected. There might be some evidence that if you eat this compound, then it does this and it's good. But it's also, in line with this sort of single cause, single event or single effect thinking, which is, if anything, like a really, really coarse approximation to how things work, apart from the fact that, it may not be even, it's a very Western goal to live very long. And it's also, triggered by an individualistic approach on things, which is also derived from like this whole spirit of Darwinian evolution, the individualism, and, so I don't know. I don't give it much thought. I think it's a little simple.
I agree, but I was just thinking about it, and it just kind of fit in with this simplistic one cause or one if like in this in this world of orchestration and collaboration and complexity, it seemed like a very, like this human one-dimensional way of getting,
Right.
at least. All right, we're
Right.
getting close to the hour. I
Okay.
could go on for 6 more if we needed to, but we should wrap up. But you said you had 2 examples and 2 drawings, and I would.
Yes, I want to show you the other drawing. I was
Okay.
actually quite thinking that I may not have the opportunity to show it, but I will show you the second drawing, which is also an interesting collaboration and symbiosis in nature. Let me find it for you. So here's the other drawing. Can you see what it shows?
A cuttlefish, maybe?
Yes, it's a little squid. And it's only 3 centimeters long. And it lives in Hawaii. So it's like tiny.
Yes.
And it's quite interesting because you know that these animals, they can, change their appearance using specific mechanisms in their skin. But this one is quite interesting. When they are born, when they're hatchlings, they find a specific type. Oh no, wait, I should rewind. What they can do, let me talk about what they can do first.
Yes.
When they swim in the evening through the ocean, they cast a shadow from the moonlight.
Mm-hmm.
And so fish, they see that and they see, oh, there's a shadow, and they just eat them.
Yes.
So they figured out how to compensate for that. They are bioluminescent on their bottom. So they compensate exactly the moonlight and the stars.
That's insane. It's like
It's
a
totally
Harry
insane.
Potter invisibility cloak.
Yeah, it's an
level.
invisibility cloak, and they're like these little sort of invertebrates, and that alone is pretty crazy.
Yes.
But this is how they do it. They are not bioluminescent. Inside of them, they have a special organ, and that organ hosts bacteria, and they are bioluminescent. And they don't, unlike the insect, they don't live there forever. But the little hatchlings, when they're born, they need to find them in the ocean. They float around in the ocean, these bacteria, and they just take them. And then these bacteria, they are transported through specific pathways into this organ. Now, this pathway is also open to other bacteria, but the little squid makes sure that only the right bacteria get to this organ. I don't know how that works, but they manage to do it. And once the bacteria are there, they find nice nutrients, and they replicate and multiply and build this luminescent organ. And then you could think, okay, that's fine. We're done. Now I have my luminescent organ, and I can, have my invisibility cloak. But they don't do that. Every evening, they get rid of 90% of these bacteria and just put them back in the ocean.
Yes.
So other hatchlings can find them.
Yeah.
And the remaining 10%, they grow again and multiply and form the organ. So they repeat this. And not only do they collaborate with the bacteria, they also share them with the next generation this way. It's pretty crazy.
That is unbelievable. I mean,
it's insane.
Like one of my arguments for the awesomeness of science is that no artist could have come up with quantum mechanics, no human imagination. Only nature could give you something so nuts and mad. And so I use that as a kind of example of the poetry of nature, or that human, like that somehow as if science is boring and human creativity is exciting. But this seems to me to be the kind of biology example that's so crazy that whoever says there's intelligent design have to be like, yes. I mean, no one would design this. It's so ingenious.
You can't design it. It's totally nuts.
Yeah, like whatever kind of what is it, anthropomorphic god that they have in mind. Well, this is not how they would have done it. That's this god, right?
Exactly. One more thing. Give me one more. It's
Let's do it.
Because I was just thinking about it because I thought it's also crazy. I was thinking about photosynthesis, which is a plant thing, right? Or one like specific type of bacteria do that too. But there's this worm, I can't remember the name of it. It has a mouth, but it doesn't have a digestion tract, or like, it doesn't have guts. It just has a mouth.
Yes.
And when it's born with its mouth, it eats a specific type of algae. And they crawl under, these cells, they crawl under the skin of that worm, and the worm turns green. And there they do photosynthesis. And once the worm has done it, it changes its mouth, it just loses it. So this worm never eats. It just uses the, photosynthetic algae to provide all it requires.
Yes.
So it's a worm that has lost its entire digestion system and uses its mouth only in the beginning of its life, and then loses that too, just to, gather photosynthetic plants that live under the skin. It's pretty crazy. I mean, that's another example that, you couldn't come up with this.
Yes, Dirk, you're beginning to convince me why biology is fun, and that everyone should work on this. So this is so great. I have a whole page of questions for you that we never got to, so we'll have to do it again. But I enjoyed it so much. So exciting.
Read the paper and the book.
I'll get on it.